Hey folks, it's William with All Solar Texas. If you are a Texas homeowner and you are concerned with grid reliability, if you're concerned with energy independence, if you're tired of power brownouts and blackouts, watch this video. I'm going to break down the top vulnerabilities to the Texas grid. Stay tuned. The number one threat to the Texas grid, in my opinion, of course, is the rapid population growth. This grid was built in some parts of Texas over 100 years ago, and then in other parts of Texas where there's been more rapid expansion within these cities that have rapidly grown, they have invested a lot more in their infrastructure, and so you'll have grid lines that could be 10, 20, 30 years old. But if you look at the grid on its entirety, it's a very old and very fragile grid. With additional people moving every single day, the last I read, we had over 1,000 people moving to Texas to live every single day. And that doesn't even include the numbers that we're seeing of immigration and illegal immigrants coming across the border. That number's in the thousands, which means that we have thousands of people moving to Texas every day, which is tens of thousands every month and hundreds of thousands every year. And if you extrapolate that, we're looking at millions of people having moved here over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. Yet our grid can't keep up. So that rapid growth means that you have more people putting more demand on that grid. It's no different than if you were trying to bodybuild. You don't just step up to the bench and throw on 400 pounds and expect to lift it. You have to slowly build up that strength and that muscle. So you start with the 100 pounds, then go up to 150 pounds, and you slowly build up until you can get up to that target weight that you want to lift. But here's the problem. What if you're just starting out and you can only lift 100 pounds or maybe 150, and then people start putting weights on that same day? We just start putting on more weights and more weights. You're not only not going to be able to lift that weight, but you're going to collapse under that weight. That's what we're seeing with the grid. It takes years and years for the grid to become more reliable through capital investment. There's multiple years of planning that goes into making the grid more resilient, millions of dollars in capital that needs to be raised that normally comes from either investors or just from customers. All of that investment, all of that planning, land rights, engineering, design, sourcing, purchasing of the equipment, that takes years to do. Yet we have a grid that is very old, cannot keep up with the population that's rapidly growing and increasing during that same amount of time of planning. Number two, extreme weather events. We saw record high temperatures this last summer, which put an increased strain on the grid, and we saw grid failures all across the board. If you remember February 2021, we had a substantial freeze come through, and that knocked out power to thousands and thousands of customers and actually cost people their lives. Over 200 people died during that winter ice event. We also have tornadoes that we're seeing pop up more and more across the northern parts of Texas. We have hurricanes that are coming in further inland. If you take a look at Hurricane Harvey and how far that hurricane actually came in and brought all of the flooding along with it. The extreme weather events that we're seeing here in Texas are putting an additional strain on an already strained grid, which means that it is going to break more often than we've ever seen it before. ERCOT took a look and did a deep assessment in 2022. They hired a third-party consultant to come in and get a better understanding of where the grid was in terms of its reliability. They did not do well. They did not score well. And the legislature can't move fast enough. We can't increase rates fast enough. We can't order materials fast enough. We can't keep up with the demand that's being put on this grid by the extreme weather events, which means only one thing: more power outages, more drastic power outages, longer duration power outages, which means you as a customer are going to be left in the dark much more than you ever have before in the history of Texas. Number three, the third threat to the Texas grid is aging equipment and supply chain issues. Again, much of this equipment in many parts of Texas was installed 80 years, 100 years ago. Now, you might find that hard to believe. All you have to do is drive down any county road, pull over, take a look at one of the poles that were installed, and they have a nail. I came from the utility industry, so I was always interested in how long a certain pole had been placed in ground. In fact, it's a whole thing with linemen out there. If they find a nail with the year that particular pole was installed and it's really old, 50, 60, 80, 100 years old, they keep it. It's one of those things that they just kind of compete with to see how old of a pole can they find to work on, and then they'll keep that nail there that time stamps the year that pole was installed. So you can see just by looking at different poles along the way that these poles were installed many, many years ago. Not just the poles themselves, but the wires. And the wires have been hit by years and years of weather events, weatherization, wind, rain, all the different hail, everything else that we see here in Texas, as well as the transformers and the components. These pieces of equipment are weatherized. They're meant to be installed for decades, really. But once you get to the end of the lifespan of those components, they start to break down, they start to fail. And it's really difficult to get out there in a timely fashion to replace those things. In addition, you have supply chain issues. There's a really interesting situation that we have now with transformers across the US. Transformer supply is really low, which means transformers that are required in order to step down higher voltages to lower voltages to get that electricity down to a voltage that you can use as a customer in your home is becoming more scarce, which means if there is a transformer malfunction, or if a transformer blows out because it's overloaded and overheated through a summer heat wave, it's going to be less likely that they're going to be able to find that transformer and replace it in a timely manner, because it's taking months in some cases to get transformers in. So the whole supply chain is at risk of getting the types of critical infrastructure needed by utilities to make the replacements and to make the investments in their grid that is needed to make it more reliable, to make it more safe, and to make sure that power is flowing to all of the different customers at the end of the line. Now, if you're interested in learning more about our grid vulnerabilities due to supply chain issues as well as aging equipment, I really recommend this fantastic book called The Grid. This book is not just focused on the Texas grid, but it's focused more broadly on the American grid. However, all of the observations and the assessments done in this book are completely applicable to the Texas grid. It's a fantastic book if you want to learn more about how vulnerable we are, how aging equipment really is a threat to our modern society that's becoming more electrified and not less. Fantastic resource to check out if you want to learn more about that particular threat to the grid. The fourth largest threat to the Texas electric grid is terrorism. Now, I'm not talking about foreign terrorism where a terrorist hijacks a plane and flies it into a substation. What I'm talking about is local domestic terrorism. Now, our grid is a network of wires, of poles, of towers, of substations and transformers and other critical components. It is very, very easy. People don't realize how easy it is to actually disrupt the entire Texas grid for a particular region. I'm not just talking about a neighborhood. I'm talking about a particular region, a city, a county, by the vulnerabilities that are inherent in, let's say, substations. In California, we saw this. Pacific Gas and Electric several years ago had a domestic terrorist attack where somebody or a couple of people, they're not quite sure who or how it happened because these people were never caught, but they fired several rifle rounds at a critical transformer within the Metcalf substation and caused millions of dollars of damage that took months of repair and knocked thousands of people out of power for weeks. We also recently saw this on the East Coast where someone fired some rifle rounds at a transformer in a substation, and with the amount of work that it takes to order a replacement, to get that sourced and shipped, to make the repairs, these people were out of power for weeks. And I'm not talking about just a couple dozen or a few hundred. Thousands of people were out of power for weeks. It is very, very easy. People don't realize how vulnerable we are to power disruption by domestic terrorists because of the way that our grid is wired. It is all interconnected. And if you have a certain vulnerability within a certain part of the grid, like an older substation, it is very easy to disrupt that energy supply. And then downstream, you are taking out thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of people because of the damage that's easily done through just firing a rifle round at a transformer and taking it out. I'm not talking about tinfoil hat stuff here where it needs to be very large and elaborate plan. I'm just talking about the types of vulnerabilities that are inherent because our equipment is so vulnerable. Our equipment is so sensitive, not just to weather, but just to any types of disruptions that can cause multiple failures across an entire grid line. The more connected we are and the more linked we are and the more customers that a particular part of the grid feeds, the more vulnerable those people are to being out of power if that particular center point of that grid line gets attacked. With domestic terrorists, it could be anybody. It could be a disgruntled employee at a particular utility that wants to make a point. It could be a couple of guys just out trying to have a good time and having a good time in the wrong way and being destructive and shutting down power for thousands of people. Or it could be even something more malicious than that. People actually planning a targeted attack on the weakest parts of the grid that will take out way more of the power that we would ever assume could possibly be taken out by just one or two bad actors. So domestic terrorism is a real threat. We have seen it happen here in the United States. We've seen it happen at different substations and with different utilities. Nobody is immune to it, and we certainly aren't either, and it is a real threat to our grid. Number 5, cyber attacks. Cyber attacks are still a threat to our grid, but they're not as big of a threat as those other items that I discussed early on. The reason why is this: we as a grid are interconnected. Yes, we're connected by wires and by systems and by towers and components, but most of that is not necessarily all operating off of the same systems, which means this: we can have substations that use different protocols, different software to run all of their processes. We have different softwares and tools that co-ops use versus municipalities versus your larger utilities like Encore and CenterPoint and AEP. We have so many utilities here in Texas that they're not all on the same system. Now, they use some similar systems to execute some of their protocols and processes and track their repair work. Absolutely, there are some similarities here. But when you look at what would make us vulnerable to a cyber attack would have to target a particular system that unifies the vast majority of a particular part of our grid. And we just don't see that. We don't have that. We're not operating off of the same systems. We're not using the same protocols. And so even if a cyber attack was to occur at one utility, we would easily be able to isolate that cyber attack to just that part of that utility's grid or that part of that utility's system that it affected, and then disconnect from everywhere else. So it's not very likely that a cyber attack would occur and would be able to inflict damage for a broad region of Texas. But that simply has to do with the fact that we have so many utilities. They're not all connected through the same systems and protocols and software. So even if you did have an incident, you could pretty much isolate that incident. However, when you look at where our grid is located, from a cyber attack perspective, it could happen. And if you were to have a cyber attack at a particular utility, a very large utility, like let's say Encore, then it would be quite damaging for all the customers and businesses that would be impacted in a particular region of Texas just for that service territory. But if we're looking for broad issues where we could take down the entire Texas grid through a cyber attack, that's very unlikely, but it's still number 5 in my opinion. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about cyber attacks and how cyber attacks are a threat to our grid, feel free to check out Ted Koppel's book, Lights Out. Ted Koppel did a really good detailed journalistic investigation about our grid. Again, we're talking about the United States grid, but everything is applicable for our local Texas grid here. But check it out. He goes into detail about what are some of the major vulnerabilities of our grid, why our grid is so fragile, and why it's such a national threat to have a grid that is so vulnerable in a time where we are more electrified than ever. Last but not least, number 6, an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. Now, what is an EMP? Well, an EMP is a surge. It is a power surge that can come from multiple different types of sources. There could be a nuclear weapon that's detonated in the atmosphere that causes an electromagnetic power surge that essentially fries all the electric components and wiring and everything that is within the radius of that pulse or that blast. Feel free to look up EMPs. If you really want to have a lot of anxiety and have trouble sleeping, look at the type of damage that an EMP can do. It's not like a normal blast where, like let's say a nuclear blast, where there's a bomb and there's a bunch of radiation and it just, plows over buildings and plows over structures and just takes out vehicles. It's not like that. It's a pulse that you could not see, you could not hear, you could not feel as a person, because it won't affect us physically and it won't affect our buildings structurally, but it will affect all of the wiring, all the cabling, all the interconnections, all the circuitry that's associated with a particular region that gets hit by that blast. Now, if an EMP strike were to happen, we would be completely vulnerable. There's no real way that you could protect yourself from an EMP or your electronic systems, not largely. There's certain things that you could do on a small scale. You could learn about Faraday cages and how you could build Faraday cages for certain devices. You could look into EMP hardened devices. I know that there's certain gun safes out on the market that have an electronic keypad that are EMP protected, as well as certain solar components. I know Solarc as an inverter has an EMP hardened version of its inverter, but you're still looking at pieces of technology that you could insulate and make more resistant and resilient against an EMP. But when you look at broadly how our lives are lived and how our society is built, you can't protect everything. And so an EMP blast happening, it doesn't even need to be targeted in a particular region of Texas. It could happen in the atmosphere, next to Texas. It could happen in the atmosphere miles and miles above, and you wouldn't even know that it occurred until you went to turn on your phone, turn on your computer, turn on your TV, turn on your car, and it doesn't work. So think of how vulnerable we would be if an EMP blast happened and it took out every electrical appliance and every electrical component that we rely on here. I'm talking about hospitals, police stations, schools, our homes, our businesses. It is a very scary thought to think about, and it's one of those things that we need to consider when we're going solar and trying to become more energy independent. Is what is it that we're relying on, and how can we best protect ourselves from an occurrence like an EMP blast in the atmosphere? Along with EMPs, we can also look at solar flares. So over 100 years ago, there was a solar flare, and what a solar flare is it's just a burst of photons that comes out of the sun. The sun's only a few minutes away in terms of the speed of light in which photons travel. So if there was a solar flare from the sun and it hit our grid at a particular point in time, and if that solar flare was strong enough, it could literally wipe out an entire hemisphere of electrical components, or an entire state, an entire grid, or an entire region of the world. Solar flares occur more often than you would think, but if they hit at just the right place in our grid, or if it's just the right intensity, it could completely knock us out of power for not just weeks, but months. It takes months, if not years, to do the type of structural repairs to get the grid back up and running if we were hit by an EMP or a solar flare. So there's not a whole lot we could do to insulate ourselves from the impact of an EMP or a solar flare. There's certain pieces of equipment that we can get in our solar build to make it more resilient to EMP blasts, but nothing is guaranteed. So an EMP blast or a solar flare, even though it is a real threat to the grid, and it does happen, it has happened before, it's not necessarily something we could do a lot about, but it is something that we need to factor in our own emergency preparedness to make sure that we have enough food supply supply, enough water supply, so that we're taking care of our basic essential needs and our family's basic essential needs and our community's basic essential needs in the event that our entire electrical system was wiped out by one of these devices. All right, folks, sorry to be a bummer. I know that we typically don't like thinking about what are all the ways that our grid can go down and how vulnerable and exposed we could be as a society. But it really is something that we need to factor in as we prepare our families and we prepare our communities for disaster. I'm not just talking about a hurricane or a tornado coming through. I'm talking about any of these contributing factors to a potential loss of power, a long-term loss of power. We are more reliant on electricity today than we ever have been as a society, than we've ever been as a species. And we're only getting more electrified as we look toward the future with electric vehicles. Now we have entire homes that are completely electric. There's no natural gas or propane required on site. The more we become electrified as a society, the more vulnerable we become when our electricity goes out. And that is something that we need to prepare for. It's something we need to think about as we try to protect our communities and our families from any potential loss, long-term loss of electricity. All right, folks, that wraps it up for today. Thank you so much for checking out the channel. I wish you the best and God bless.